I want to start by saying something that nobody else is going to say in whatever official record this ends up being, because everybody else who was there is either too embarrassed or too proud to admit it. We laughed at him. Every single one of us. Humans, Vrethkai, Salyun delegates, even the Neresi ground crew who are supposed to maintain what they call diplomatic neutrality at all times, they laughed too. I saw it. Prelin, you can put that in your little document. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen just because it's inconvenient for the narrative. We laughed at Walt Greer, and then Walt Greer saved the most dangerous apex predator in the known galaxy. And now half the species we share the hub with would die for that man, and the other half would die of shame before they admitted they once called his vehicle a quote. And I'm translating here, so forgive the rough edges, a primitive combustion-powered disgrace. That's where I want to start, not with the crisis, not with the rescue. I want to start with the laugh because I think that's the part that actually matters. That's the part that tells you everything. So here's what you need to understand about Nexus Hub Orvath, because if you've never been there, the description in the standard transit guides doesn't do it justice. Those guides say things like, a bustling multi-species commercial and diplomatic transit station, and that is technically accurate the way saying the ocean is a body of water is technically accurate. It doesn't tell you what it feels like to stand in docking ring 7 for the first time. What it feels like is chaos, beautiful, terrifying, loud, overwhelming chaos. The hub itself is a structure roughly the size of a small moon, not quite moon-sized, but you couldn't tell that from the inside. It has 47 docking rings, each one calibrated for the specific atmospheric preferences of whichever species uses it most frequently. Ring 7 was one of the mixed atmosphere rings. Oxygen-nitrogen blend on the human side, shifting gradient toward the Vrethkai methane preference on the east corridor, and the Neresi section kept its own sealed environment because the Neresi don't share air with anyone. Not out of rudeness, it's just chemistry. The hub had been operational for about 60 years by the time this story happened. Humans had been part of the Galactic Coalition for 32 of those years, which in galactic terms means we were still basically infants, new to the table, still learning which fork to use, so to speak. Most of the older species, the Vrethkai, the Salyun, the Garen, the Pralanthi, they'd been around the Coalition for anywhere between 200 and 4,000 years. They had history with each other. Alliances, grudges, trade agreements that spanned generations, cultural understandings that went so deep they didn't even have to explain them anymore. And then there were humans. Loud, messy, emotionally volatile, biologically improbable humans, capable of surviving conditions that should kill us, capable of running at things that should terrify us, capable of being deeply, profoundly sentimental about objects and machines in ways that most other species found either baffling or faintly disturbing. Walt Greer was, in a lot of ways, the most human I have ever met in my life. I first saw him about 3 months before the incident. I'd just been assigned to docking ring 7 as part of the Human Galactic Liaison rotation. Basically, my job was to smooth over misunderstandings between human personnel and visiting species, which sounds diplomatic and was mostly exhausting. I was walking the South Maintenance Corridor on my second week when I heard a sound that absolutely did not belong in a space station. It was a cough, not a biological cough, a mechanical one. A low, rattling, slightly wet mechanical exhalation that I associated immediately and involuntarily with the inside of my grandfather's garage back in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when I was 8 years old, watching him try to coax his 1978 pickup truck back to life. I turned around and there was Walt's vehicle coming around the corner. Now I need to describe this vehicle. I need to describe it properly because I've seen the official incident reports and they just say maintenance vehicle, human standard, designation GW7. And that tells you absolutely nothing about what it was actually like to see it moving through the corridors of one of the most advanced transit stations in the known galaxy. It was, by the most generous assessment, a modified utility vehicle. The base chassis looked like it might have started life as something vaguely resembling a golf cart, one of those open-frame electric utility runners that maintenance crews use in large facilities. But Walt had been working on Ring 7 for 11 years, and in 11 years he had made modifications. The frame had been extended on both sides with what looked like welded steel tubing, actual steel, not any of the synthetic alloys the hub typically used. There were compartments bolted on. Many compartments. Compartments of varying sizes and materials, some of them clearly repurposed from other things. One of them had definitely been a military-grade waterproof storage case at some point. You could still see the stenciling on the side. There was a winch mounted on the front. A real winch, the kind you'd see on an Earth-terrain vehicle. There was a rack on top loaded with tools that would have looked at home in any automotive shop back on Earth. Wrenches, pry bars, a hydraulic jack, things I couldn't immediately identify. The vehicle made 3 sounds. There was the electric motor hum, which was standard. There was a secondary sound that I eventually identified as the ventilation fan for a cooling system Walt had apparently installed himself, because the motor ran hot in Ring 7's ambient temperature. And there was the cough. The cough happened every time the vehicle slowed down or stopped, this low, mechanical throat clearing that Walt never seemed to notice because he'd been hearing it for years. Walt himself was in the driver's seat, which was the original seat plus a cushion duct taped to it, and, inexplicably, a small wooden armrest attached to the left side by what appeared to be a hose clamp. He was 63 years old. He had the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors early in life, and then a lot of time under fluorescent lighting after that. Gray hair, close-cropped, hands that looked like they'd been built for gripping things. He was wearing his maintenance coveralls, standard hub issue, dark blue, but his had so many patches and pen marks and unidentifiable stains that the original fabric was almost a memory. He had a thermos in the cup holder he'd added to the dashboard, and I would later learn that the thermos contained coffee, actual Earth coffee, which he had shipped in from the human supply depot on Station Kalak at no small personal expense. He saw me standing there and nodded, the way mechanics nod when they pass you, that small, upward chin tilt that says, "I see you, I'm busy, no offense." Then he drove past me, the vehicle coughing once as it slowed to navigate the turn, and he disappeared around the corner. I stood there for a second. Then I pulled out my comm unit and messaged my colleague Raina back at the liaison office. "There is a man here who drove an antique into space, and nobody stopped him." She sent back, "That's Walt. Don't touch his vehicle. Don't comment on his vehicle. Just trust me." I should have asked more questions. Over the following weeks, I came to understand Walt Greer more fully, though understand might be too strong a word. I came to observe him more fully. He was a fixture of Ring 7 the way certain old trees become fixtures of a park, not decorative, not dramatic, just deeply, permanently there. He knew every system in the ring, not just the human-maintained systems, but the cross-corridor shared systems too. He'd worked with the Neresi technical crew to sort out a recurring pressure imbalance in the intersection seals that had been annoying everyone for 3 years, and he'd fixed it using a combination of standard hub components, and this is in the maintenance log. I checked. A modified valve assembly he'd machined himself from raw stock in his personal workshop. The Neresi crew chief had given him a gesture that apparently translated to something like "honored by your competence," which, coming from a Neresi, was roughly equivalent to receiving a civilian medal. He didn't socialize much, ate alone or with 1 or 2 of the older human maintenance staff, didn't attend the interspecies mixers that the Coalition Diplomacy Office organized every quarter. Not because he was antisocial exactly. When you talked to him, he was perfectly pleasant. in that unhurried, take-it-or-leave-it way of someone who didn't need you to like him. He just didn't pursue company. He had his work, and his coffee, and his vehicle, and his 11 years of accumulated knowledge about every pipe and panel and power relay in docking ring 7, and that seemed to be enough. The other maintenance staff, especially the younger ones, complained about his vehicle constantly. Not to his face, but in the break room, in the locker corridors. Why does he get to keep that thing running on the ring? It doesn't even meet current efficiency standards. The cough alone should be a noise ordinance violation. The hub administration had apparently tried twice to replace his vehicle with a standard modern unit, and Walt had apparently argued his case in both instances with enough stubborn technical detail that they'd backed down. His productivity metrics were too good. His failure rate was too low. He fixed things that the automated maintenance systems couldn't even diagnose, and he did it faster than a replacement crew would have. And the hub administration was practical enough to recognize that some things are worth the inconvenience of a cough. The visiting species found his vehicle more interesting than annoying, mostly. The Vrethkai delegation that cycled through Ring 7 during their quarterly trade visits had members who would slow down and look at it the way you'd look at a museum exhibit, curious, a little puzzled, respectful in the way you're respectful of things you don't fully understand but can tell were made with care. One of their junior diplomats had asked Walt about the winch once, and Walt had spent 20 minutes explaining its mechanical principle and practical applications, while the diplomat absorbed every word with apparent fascination. The Salyun, on the other hand, were more vocal. The Salyun had a very particular relationship with technology. They were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the coalition, and their ships and equipment operated on principles that made human engineering look like building blocks. They weren't cruel about it exactly, but they had a way of expressing technical superiority that was almost reflexive, like breathing. One of their transit coordinators had passed Walt's vehicle once and said, in perfectly clear galactic standards so everyone could hear, that she had never before seen a machine that appeared to be held together by stubbornness and narrative necessity. Walt had looked at her and said, "She runs fine," and driven away. That was Walt's entire relationship with criticism of his vehicle. 2 words. She runs fine. Not defensive, not elaborate, not interested in debate. Just a statement of fact and then forward motion. I liked him more after that. Now I need to tell you about the Keth. Because you cannot understand what happened on March 11th without understanding what the Keth are, and more specifically, what a Keth Ta is. The Keth are not members of the Galactic Coalition. That's the first thing. They're an observer species, meaning they've had contact with the Coalition for about 90 years. There are diplomatic protocols in place. There's a framework for limited interaction, but they haven't gone through formal accession. Nobody pushes them toward it. Nobody ever pushes the Keth toward anything, because the Keth do not respond well to being pushed. They are predators, not metaphorically, biologically. They evolved on Keth Prime as apex predators in an environment that sounds like someone designed a nightmare on purpose. Low light, high gravity, unpredictable atmospheric conditions, with prey animals that were fast and aggressive and capable of collective defensive behavior. The Keth survived that environment and came out the other side with senses that would make most species physically uncomfortable if you described them in detail. They can perceive electromagnetic fields. Their spatial awareness extends in ways that don't translate neatly into other species' perceptual vocabularies. They move with a silence that feels deliberate even when it isn't. Physically, their large, most adult Keth stand between 2.5 and 3 meters when fully upright, though they prefer a partial crouch when navigating spaces built for smaller species. Their coloration shifts with their internal state in ways that are involuntary, the way a human's face flushes or pales. Silver gray when calm, deeper charcoal when alert. a blue-black that most other species never want to see up close when something has triggered their threat response. They have 4 upper limbs, 2 of which function primarily as locomotion on their home world, and 2 of which function as manipulators. Their eyes are amber, large, and they don't blink frequently, which other species consistently find unnerving regardless of how much they know about keth biology. A keth is specifically a breeding-age female in what their biologists call the critical preservation window, the period during which a keth female can produce offspring. The keth have low reproductive rates to begin with. A keth is not just individually valuable. She represents, in a very literal biological sense, part of the future of her species. The keth have a word for them that doesn't translate perfectly into any language I know of, but the closest approximation in English is something like the irreplaceable ones. There were 312 keth in existence. 312 total, in the entire known galaxy. And one of them was on docking ring 7. Her name in the approximated galactic standard phonetic rendering was Vethsar. She was part of a very small diplomatic mission, 4 keth total, who had agreed to travel to Hub Orvath for what the Coalition had been careful to call a preliminary observational visit. Not negotiations, not accession talks, just a look around. An acknowledgement that the galaxy existed, and that perhaps the keth and the Coalition might benefit from knowing each other slightly better. It was the first time keth had set foot on Hub Orvath. Half the Coalition's diplomatic corps was quietly holding their breath. I saw Vethsar for the first time on the morning of March 11th. She and the other 3 members of the keth delegation were being escorted through the south corridor of Ring 7 by a team of Coalition diplomats, 3 Salyun, 2 humans from our side, and a Naresi liaison who specialized in predator species communication. They had their own atmosphere management units, small portable rigs that maintained the precise environmental conditions keth preferred. They moved slowly because everything about the hub was built for species smaller than them, and they navigated with care. Vethsar was the 3rd in the group. Her coloring was silver gray, calm, the briefing documents had said was silver gray. But she wasn't entirely silver. There was a faint shimmer of something darker along her upper limbs, which one of the keth specialists on our team had noted indicated a low-grade alertness, not alarm, just the constant attention of a predator in an unfamiliar space. She was watching everything. Not the way a nervous creature watches everything. The way a confident, calibrated intelligence watches everything when it wants to understand its environment. I was standing near the maintenance corridor junction when they passed, keeping out of the way liaison staff were supposed to during a high-priority diplomatic transit. I watched her walk past and had the distinct, slightly irrational feeling that she had cataloged everything about me, my position, my posture, my heart rate probably, for all I knew. In the half-second her attention moved across me. Then she was past me and I breathed again. Walt was in his corridor about 30 meters away, doing something to a junction panel with a socket wrench. He looked up when the delegation passed, watched them for a moment the way he watched most things, calm, observational, without obvious reaction. Then he went back to his junction panel. The delegation moved on. That was the last quiet moment we had. What happened next is something I've reconstructed from my own observations, from the security footage that was recovered later, and from the testimony of the 11 other people who were in the South Corridor when it went wrong. I'll tell you what I saw first, and then I'll fill in the parts I didn't see but that were later confirmed. What I saw was, one of the portable atmosphere management units that Vethsar was carrying failed. Not gracefully, not gradually. It gave a sound like a sharp crack, the kind of sound that punches through ambient noise and makes everyone in the vicinity freeze for a split second, and then it stopped working. For a second nothing happened. The delegation stopped. The atmosphere management unit made a secondary sound, lower, like a motor fighting itself, and then went silent. And then Vethsar made a sound. I had been briefed on Keth distress vocalizations. The briefing document described them as a low-frequency resonant sound produced in response to physiological crisis, typically indicating respiratory distress or pain. What I heard was something that bypassed every intellectual understanding I had and went straight to the part of the human nervous system that is 400 million years old and knows, on a level below language, when something large is suffering. It was, "I'm sorry, I know this is a formal record, but there isn't a clinical way to say this." It was the sound of something that should never be hurt, being hurt. Her coloring shifted, not to blue-black, to something I hadn't seen described in any briefing document, a mottled, washed-out gray that the Keth specialist would later tell me was physiological distress, acute, possibly life-threatening. The portable atmosphere unit had not just failed. It had, in failing, vented a component of the Keth atmospheric blend directly back against Vethsar's intake organs in a concentration that was causing an immediate adverse reaction. It was the equivalent of, I've heard different comparisons, but the one that stuck with me was a combination of being tear-gassed and having an allergic reaction at the same time, except in a species for whom this particular exposure had the potential to cause lasting damage to respiratory tissue. The coalition diplomats reacted immediately and, I want to be fair here, correctly. The Solyun diplomats had backup atmospheric units, smaller, emergency grade, that they deployed within seconds. The Neresi liaison had a medical kit open before most people had processed what was happening. The two human diplomats were on their comms calling for medical assistance. But here's the thing about the backup atmospheric units. They were emergency grade. They were designed for a few minutes of temporary support, not sustained maintenance of the specific atmospheric blend a Keth-Ta requires. They could keep Vethsar alive in the immediate term, but they couldn't maintain the conditions she needed for recovery. The nearest full Keth-rated atmospheric system was in the arrival bay, where the Keth delegation had first been received, Bay 17, which was roughly 400 meters away from where we were standing, through corridors that were not rated for Keth atmospheric conditions, and that were, at this particular moment, experiencing higher than usual traffic because of a cargo offload happening in the adjacent ring. 400 meters, corridors full of people, no dedicated Keth transport, no specialized equipment. And a Keth-Ta who was in respiratory distress, losing ground, with atmospheric support that would sustain her for approximately 8 minutes. I watched the coalition diplomats running calculations you could see on their faces. How long to clear the corridors? How long to get medical equipment here? How long the emergency units would last? How long before 8 minutes stopped being a workable number? I watched the Neresi liaison's hands moving over the medical kit with practiced speed, but I could see even from where I was standing that he didn't have what was needed, that this was triage, not treatment. I watched Vethsar. She was still upright. Whatever the Keth equivalent of willpower was, she had it in abundance, but her coloring was doing something that turned my stomach. Flickering. The mottled gray and silver cycling in a way that the Keth specialist would later confirm was a distress response trying to stabilize and not quite succeeding. I was calculating. Everybody was calculating. We were all doing the same terrible math and arriving at the same answer. 8 minutes wasn't enough. And then Walt Greer appeared from the maintenance corridor, driving his vehicle, and the cough rang out across the south corridor. And about 6 people looked at him with the specific expression of people who are in a crisis and have just been interrupted by something irrelevant. Walt looked at the situation for about 4 seconds. I don't know what kind of processing happens in those 4 seconds for a man like Walt Greer. I don't know if it's fast and algorithmic or if it's something slower and more instinctive. What I know is that at the end of those 4 seconds, he turned his vehicle around, backed it up toward the delegation, and said, in a voice that was completely, almost aggressively calm, How long does she need to get to Bay 17? One of the human diplomats, Elena Marsh, I think, I'd worked with her before, looked at him, looked at his vehicle, looked back at him. I could see on her face the exact moment she did the math, and the math came out to this is the only option. 8 minutes, she said, maybe less. She'll fit in the back, Walt said. I need 2 of you to manage those atmosphere units. Tell me if anything has to plug in. This is the part that I have gone back to in my head more times than I can count, in the months since March 11th, trying to figure out why it worked, and why it worked the way it did. Getting Vethsar onto Walt's vehicle should have been complicated. She was 3 meters tall and in distress, and she was a Keth, meaning her instincts in that state were not find the smallest available human and their antique golf cart and let them help you. The Keth specialist, Dr. Aya Torrens, who was with the delegation, told me afterward that her primary concern in those seconds was that Vethsar's distress response would trigger a defensive reaction. Not aggressive, not predatory, but the kind of hardwired I am injured and vulnerable, and I will not allow myself to be positioned in a way I cannot control response that apex predators develop across evolutionary time for very good reasons. What happened instead was that Vethsar looked at Walt's vehicle for a moment, and then she looked at Walt. And Walt met her eyes and didn't look away and didn't change his expression. He didn't perform calmness or perform confidence. He was just calm, actually calm. The way a mechanic is calm when a machine is broken and he knows what to do about it. Not dismissive of the severity, just not rattled by it. Later, Dr. Torrens would say that Keth in distress respond to specific nonverbal signals, that they can assess, in ways we don't fully understand, whether a creature near them is experiencing fear or threat responses, and that a creature without fear or aggression is categorically non-threatening to a Keth in that state, regardless of species or size or anything else. Walt Greer, apparently, was not afraid. Not of Vethsar, not of the situation, not of the weight of what was happening, just not afraid. Vethsar lowered herself into the back section of the vehicle. She didn't fit neatly. Her upper limbs folded in ways that looked uncomfortable and probably were. Dr. Torrens climbed on beside her, managing the emergency atmospheric unit. Elena Marsh got on the other side. Walt had already cleared the storage compartments on the left side of the vehicle to give them more room. He'd done it in about 45 seconds, just opened the compartments and pulled the contents out, and set them against the corridor wall with a precision that suggested he knew exactly what was in every compartment and where it could safely be left. Then he started driving. I ran parallel to them through the adjacent corridor, which was the only reason I saw the next part. The south corridor was not empty. It was not even close to empty. The cargo offload from Ring 6 had spilled 3 separate teams of handlers and their equipment into the connecting corridor, and there was a Vrethkai passenger group of about 30 individuals doing their slow, meditative transit walk that Vrethkai do in stations. They prefer to walk slowly and in formation, and it's a cultural practice, and you absolutely cannot rush them. It's considered a serious breach of etiquette. And there were 2 supply carts from the hub's food distribution network that had stopped in the corridor for a handoff, and were now obstacles in the most inconvenient possible position. Walt saw all of this at about the same moment I did from my parallel position, and I watched him navigate it. He didn't use a horn. His vehicle had one. I'd heard it once before, a sound like an elderly goose, because a horn in a crowded corridor would have created panic, and panic would have slowed everything down. Instead, he did something I can only describe as conducted the corridor. He called out, in a voice that was loud enough to carry but not loud enough to alarm, telling people to move right or move left with the specific authority of someone who has been in this space for 11 years and knows which requests people actually comply with. He weaved the vehicle around the supply carts, using the clearance he had with a precision that should not have been achievable in a vehicle that looked like that. The cargo handlers moved. The Vrethkai group somehow redistributed without any visible disruption to their formation. I still don't know how he managed that, and I've asked Alina Marsh and she just shakes her head. The vehicle coughed twice in the first 200 meters. Both times, Vethsar's coloring flickered and Dr. Torrens put her hand on the atmospheric unit, and both times Walt said without turning around, "That's normal. She always does that when she slows down." I don't know if Vethsar understood English in that moment. I don't know if it was the words or the tone, but both times the flickering steadied. The vehicle's ventilation cooling system, the secondary one Walt had installed himself, the one the younger maintenance staff thought was a sign of the vehicle's general dysfunction, turned out to matter. The standard hub maintenance vehicles don't have secondary cooling systems because they're not designed to carry loads above a certain weight threshold for extended distances. Vethsar plus Dr. Torrens plus Alina Marsh, plus the emergency atmospheric units, plus the existing equipment on the vehicle. The total load was, I found out later, about 60% over the nominal capacity of the original vehicle chassis. The electric motor was running hard. Without the secondary cooling system, the motor would have overheated somewhere in the second 100 meters. The motor didn't overheat. The winch on the front, the one that the Salyun Transit Coordinator had once implied was both primitive and unnecessary, turned out to matter too. At about 320 meters into the run, one of the cargo offload teams had left an equipment pallet partially blocking the main corridor junction. It was a heavy pallet. Automated cargo handling units are not known for courteous parking, and it was sitting at an angle that blocked the direct path. Walt stopped the vehicle, got out, attached the winch cable to the pallet, moved it, got back in, started driving. This took 47 seconds. I counted later from the footage. 47 seconds to identify the problem, deploy the solution, execute, and resume. None of the other personnel in that corridor had a winch. None of them had a tool that would have moved that pallet in 47 seconds. The Salyun diplomatic escort, who had caught up with the vehicle at that point, were using their comms to call for corridor clearing authorization, which would have taken several minutes minimum. Walt moved the pallet in 47 seconds and kept going. Bay 17 was 400 meters away, and they made it in 6 minutes and 20 seconds. I know that because I checked the security footage afterward, multiple times. 6 minutes and 20 seconds from the moment Walt turned his vehicle around to the moment they crossed the threshold into Bay 17, and the bay's full Keth-rated atmospheric systems activated. They had 8 minutes. They used 6.5. Vethsar was on the ground the moment they cleared the threshold, not collapsing. I want to be clear about that. It was a deliberate lowering, a controlled decision to get as close to the floor as possible and let the atmospheric system do its work from all angles. Dr. Torrens was right there with her. The Keth medical team that had been scrambled from their arrival quarters reached the bay about 90 seconds later. Walt parked his vehicle just outside the bay entrance, got out, checked the motor temperature, touched the housing with the back of his hand the way you check a pan to see if it's hot, nodded to himself. Then he looked into the bay through the transparent atmospheric separation panel at the activity around Vethsar. I came up beside him, breathing harder than he was despite the fact that I'd been running and he'd been driving. He glanced at me. "She going to be okay?" "I think so," I said. "I don't know yet." He nodded, looked back through the panel. Then he went and got his thermos from the dashboard and leaned against the side of the vehicle and drank his coffee and waited. Vethsar was okay. The Keth medical team confirmed it about 20 minutes later. The exposure had caused irritation to the respiratory tissue, some localized inflammation, but no permanent damage. She would need 2 days of rest in controlled atmospheric conditions. She was going to be fine. When this was communicated to the coalition diplomatic team, the reaction was quiet actually, not jubilant. the kind of quiet that follows the passing of a thing that could have gone very, very badly. Elena Marsh sat down on a bench in the outer corridor and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds, and then straightened up and went back to work. The Neresi liaison made a notation in his records with a hand that was not quite steady. The Salyun diplomats were already drafting the incident report. Walt finished his coffee, rinsed the thermos in the nearest maintenance sink, put it back in its holder, and drove his vehicle back to the junction panel he'd been working on when the incident started, and finished the job. The first to come to him was Dr. Aya Torrens. She found him at the junction panel about an hour later. She stood behind him for a moment. She told me this herself, watching him work. Then she said his name. He turned around. She said, in the formal version of English that non-native speakers often use for things they want to say precisely. "What you did, I want you to understand what you actually did. A Kethta, if she had been seriously injured, if she had died. The diplomatic consequences alone would have set back contact with the Keth by decades. And beyond the diplomacy, she is one of 312. She is not a number. She is one of 312 individuals who represent the continuation of a species. You put her in your vehicle, and you got her to safety." Walt looked at her. "The vehicle runs fine," he said. Dr. Torrens laughed. She said it was the most unexpected laugh she'd had in years. "I want to add one thing to what Corporal Harwick has documented, because I think it belongs in the historical record. 3 days after the incident, Vethsar requested a meeting. Not with the coalition diplomatic team, not with the medical staff, with Walt Greer. The meeting was arranged with a certain amount of logistical complexity because Vethsar's atmospheric requirements and the available meeting spaces required some creative thinking, but it happened. In the outer area of Bay 17, with the transparent atmospheric panel between them. I was present as translator, though I was not needed as much as I expected. Vethsar approached the panel. Walt was on the other side in his coveralls, his thermos in his hand. She placed one of her manipulator limbs against the panel. It was, I knew, a Keth gesture, physical proximity across a barrier, which in their social vocabulary indicated something between acknowledgement and formal recognition. Gratitude doesn't quite translate. It's something larger than gratitude and more structural. The recognition of a debt that changes the terms of a relationship. Walt looked at her hand against the panel, looked up at her face. Then he placed his own hand against the panel, palm flat, on the other side of hers. He didn't know the gesture's meaning. He told me that afterward he'd just done what seemed right, what seemed like the correct answer to what she was offering. Vethsar held the position for a long moment. Then she made a sound. Low, resonant, nothing like the distress vocalization. Something else entirely, a sound the Keth use, I have read, when they are in the presence of something that has earned permanent recognition. Something that in their language carries roughly the weight of "you are known to us now. You will not be forgotten." Walt's hand against the panel, her hand against the other side. I have been working with alien species for 19 years. I have witnessed first contacts and diplomatic breakthroughs and moments that will end up in history books. I have never felt the particular quality of that moment in Bay 17, and I am not sure I will again. He said afterward, when I asked him what it had been like. Strange good. Like when a machine you've been worried about settles down and runs right, like that. Archivist's note. Prelin Voss, Galactic Historical Preservation Society. The Salyun Transit Coordinator, who referred to Walt Greer's vehicle as a primitive combustion-powered disgrace, has requested that this description not appear in the official record. It appears in the official record. The Coalition Transportation Authority subsequently reviewed the maintenance vehicle designation, GW7, and issued a formal assessment. The assessment found that the vehicle's non-standard modifications, including the secondary cooling system, the additional cargo compartments, the forward winch assembly, and the extended load frame, represented practical engineering adaptations derived from extensive operational experience, demonstrating functional superiority over standard-issue maintenance vehicles in high-load, corridor navigation, time-critical scenarios. The assessment recommended that the hub's maintenance fleet consider adopting similar modifications. Walt Greer was offered a consulting fee to advise on the modification protocol. He asked if he could just keep using his own vehicle instead. The hub administration said yes. The vehicle still coughs when it slows down. It still runs fine. There are things about Walt Greer that weren't in any of the briefing materials I had when I arrived at Ring 7, and that weren't in the incident reports filed after March 11th, and that I think are necessary to include here because they explain the man and they explain the vehicle and they explain, I think, why the moment in Bay 17 happened the way it did. Walt Greer grew up in Beckley, West Virginia. His father was a mining equipment mechanic. His grandfather was a mining equipment mechanic. Walt, who showed aptitude for the work from an early age, was expected to be a mining equipment mechanic. Instead, he joined the Earth Planetary Defense Service at age 20, shortly after first contact with the Vrethkai, in the general wave of enlistment that followed humanity's discovery that they were not alone in the universe, and that alone had felt safer than alone didn't mean anything anymore. He spent 9 years in the EPDS, mostly in technical maintenance roles, spacecraft systems, ground support equipment, the complex mechanical interdependencies that keep human beings alive in environments that do not particularly want them alive. He left the EPDS with a record that the personnel files describe in the dry, compressed language of official documentation: distinguished service, multiple commendations for technical excellence, early discharge at subject's request, but which one of his former commanding officers, reached by archivist's inquiry, described differently. Walt Greer could fix anything, not metaphorically, I mean that literally. I have never once in 30 years in this service seen him stand in front of a broken machine and not know what to do next. It's not a trick. It's not training exactly, or it's not only training. It's something he has. The way some people have a feel for language or music. He has it for machines. After the EPDS, he spent 3 years doing freelance maintenance work in the orbital station network around Earth. That's where he acquired the vehicle's base chassis, a decommissioned Earth-standard ground utility vehicle from a station that was being renovated, which he got for almost nothing because nobody else wanted it. He'd been modifying it ever since. When he took the position at Hub Orvath 11 years ago, he had the vehicle shipped with his personal effects, which the Hub's receiving records note with an annotation that translates to unusual personal item, flagged for dimensions check, cleared for transit. He'd been offered better positions. 3 times that I found in the records, twice at higher-tier stations with better pay and facilities, once at the Coalition's new engineering hub at Station Myrth, where the work would have been genuinely cutting-edge. He declined all 3. He liked Ring 7. He knew Ring 7. He knew where every problem lived and how it liked to present itself and what it actually needed versus what it asked for. Old stations are like old trucks, he told me during our interview when I asked why he'd stayed. Easier to work on once you understand them. New stuff is all sealed systems and diagnostic codes. Ring 7's got actual guts you can get your hands into. I asked him about the commendations from his EPDS service. He said they were for doing my job. I asked him what he thought when he'd seen the Keth delegation in distress on March 11th. He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just thinking. I thought, okay, what's the problem, what's the time limit, what have I got? And had a vehicle, had time enough if I moved right, didn't see what else there was to think about. I found one more thing in the records that I want to include here, because I think it matters. In the EPDS personnel files, there is a commendation from year 6 of Walt's service. It relates to an incident on a survey station in the outer orbital zone, not classified but not publicized either. A pressure system failure, multiple personnel in danger. Walt Greer had sealed 3 failing joints with materials that the commendation report describes as improvised components fabricated from non-standard materials under extreme time pressure, and had kept the pressure stable long enough to evacuate everyone. The report notes that afterward, when asked how he'd known which materials would work, he'd said, "They were what I had." The commendation board had added a note. Greer's response reflects a practical engineering philosophy, the prioritization of available solutions over ideal ones, that represents a genuinely valuable professional disposition in crisis contexts. He was 26 years old at the time. He is 63 now, and apparently he still thinks the same way. They were what I had. A vehicle that coughs. Compartments full of tools. 11 years of knowing this ring. A winch that a Salyun diplomat once called unnecessary. They were what he had. She runs fine. The Keth delegation did not leave after Veth Sar's recovery. They had been scheduled for a 5-day observational visit. They stayed for 3 weeks. The coalition diplomatic team, trying not to appear as excited as they were, asked carefully through Dr. Torrens whether the extended stay was a deliberate decision or a logistical convenience. The answer came back through the formal Keth communication protocol, which involves a level of indirection that makes diplomatic communication between humans feel almost blunt. That Veth Sar had indicated a desire to better understand the mechanics of this station and the beings who maintain it. The Keth sent a formal inquiry to Hub Orvath administration, requesting a structured tour of the maintenance systems. Walt was asked to lead the tour. He said, "I'm not a tour guide." Hub administration said, "We know, but they asked specifically for the one who fixed things." Walt thought about it. "Tell them they can come watch me work. I'm not doing a presentation." Dr. Torrens relayed this to the Keth delegation. The Keth delegation accepted. What followed over the next 2 weeks became something that nobody had planned and nobody had a protocol for, and that turned out, by the reckoning of coalition diplomatic analysts, to be one of the more significant informal relationship-building developments in the 32 years of human membership in the coalition. Veth Sar and, on alternating days, 1 or 2 of the other Keth delegates accompanied Walt on his maintenance rounds. They couldn't go everywhere he went, because Ring 7's corridors aren't uniformly Keth accessible, and the atmospheric requirements added a logistical layer. But they managed large sections of it. The Keth wore portable atmospheric rigs that were better than the failed unit from March 11th, new models, properly tested, with backup redundancy. Walt drove his vehicle through his daily routes and the Keth walked alongside, and Dr. Torrens translated when translation was needed, and often it wasn't. Walt doesn't narrate his work, he just does it. He goes to a system, he assesses it, he identifies what needs doing, he does it. He doesn't explain his reasoning aloud unless asked, and he doesn't perform for observers. What the Keth saw was a human moving through a familiar environment with total confidence, interacting with machines the way Dr. Torrens told me, searching for the right comparison, the way a Keth moves through familiar terrain. No performance, no self-consciousness. Just competence. The Keth have a concept in their social vocabulary for individuals who have achieved a level of mastery in their domain that makes their actions appear effortless. It's not a word exactly, it's closer to a classification, a recognition. They began applying it to Walt on, apparently, the 3rd day. He found out about this classification a week later when Dr. Torrens told him. He said, "Huh," and asked if she wanted to see the issue he'd found with the pressure relay in Section C. The Keth delegation left Hub Orvath after 3 weeks. the formal communiqué they issued through the Coalition Observer Framework, which coalition diplomatic analysts spent 3 days parsing because formal Keth communiques require that kind of investment, contained a passage that, in the most direct translation Dr. Torrens was able to provide, said something like, "We have observed this station and the beings who maintain it. Among them is one whose relationship to function is recognized. We name him as known to the Keth. This designation carries weight in our protocols. Where this individual goes, he goes with our recognition." The Coalition Diplomatic Office responded appropriately and solemnly, and then, once the response was sent, spent the next 4 days in a state of barely contained astonishment, because what the Keth had just done was, in their social framework, an extraordinary thing. The designation of known to the Keth, the formal version of the gesture Vethsar had made at the panel in Bay 17, had been applied to perhaps a dozen beings in the Keth's 90 years of contact with the broader galaxy. It was not a diplomatic courtesy. It was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a permanent, binding recognition that placed the named individual under a specific set of Keth social obligations, protections, really, and an open channel that bypassed normal diplomatic protocols entirely. Coalition analysts were already calculating what this meant for future Keth contact, what it enabled, what had shifted. Walt, when told about the formal designation, asked if it meant he needed to do any extra paperwork. Dr. Torrens laughed again. "She told me she's been laughing at Walt Greer more than she expected to laugh at anything this year, and she considers it a genuine gift." In August of 2291, 6 months after March 11th, the Keth Observer Mission sent a communiqué to the Coalition expressing formal interest in expanded observational engagement, which the diplomatic corps understood to be, in effect, the beginning of a conversation about accession. Not a commitment, not even close to a commitment, but a conversation. The communiqué specifically requested that any expanded engagement be facilitated through Hub Orvath. Hub Orvath specifically meaning, per a secondary notation in the communiqué that took 2 weeks to fully parse, the station where the one whose relationship to function is recognized was based. The Coalition Diplomatic Office spent a considerable amount of time discussing the implications. Then one of the human diplomats on the team, Elena Marsh, who had been there on March 11th, said, "Someone should tell Walt." Someone did tell Walt. He was in the middle of replacing a filtration component in the South Corridor Air Management System. He listened to the summary, thought about it for a moment. "So they want to visit more. Essentially, they're welcome, good engineers." He went back to the filtration component. Concluding note, Archivist Prelin Voss. "I've been compiling historical records for the Galactic Historical Preservation Society for 22 years. In that time, I have documented battles and treaties and scientific breakthroughs and diplomatic crises. I have documented first contacts and last stands, and the particular human habit of doing the thing nobody expected in the moment when it mattered. I have never documented a case quite like this one, and I have been trying, in the weeks since I completed the primary interviews, to articulate what makes it feel different. I think it is this. Most of the significant moments in the historical record involve people who knew they were in a significant moment, leaders who made decisions knowing those decisions would be remembered, diplomats who crafted language with historical weight in mind, warriors who charged knowing the charge would be studied. Walt Greer, on March 11, 2291, did not know he was in a significant moment. He saw a problem, he had a vehicle, the vehicle ran fine. He fixed the problem. The galaxy is, in ways still being calculated, different for it, the most precious predator species survivor alive, breathing. A diplomatic channel opened that might take decades to fully understand. A recognition extended by a species that almost never extends it, to a man who asked only if it required extra paperwork. I asked Walt, at the end of our interview, what he thought about being in a historical record. He said, "It's your job, write what you need." Then he got in his vehicle, and the vehicle coughed once as it started moving, and he drove away down the maintenance corridor, and the cough echoed back for a moment in the stillness he'd left behind.